Let's start with a karakia. Whakarongo ake au ki te tangi a te tui a. Tui a I runga, tui a I raro. Tui a I waho, tui a I roto. Ka rongo te pō, ka rongo te au, ka awatia. Tihei, mauri ora. Tēnā rā koutou katoa, no ingarangi me kotirana o kutipuna I tipu au I raro I te raukura o te Aotearoa I te awa kairangi, ko Holly Walker tōku ingoa no Pita Oni ahau, nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everybody to this webinar and thank you so much for joining us. For those who are joining from outside of Aotearoa, I've just started with a karakia or a prayer which asks us all to listen to the call of the tui. That's one of our native birds here, a call that unites us, stitches things together and strengthens the web of connections between people and the natural world. And I then explained that my ancestors come from England and Scotland, that I grew up under the feathers of the Te Aotearoa people, the mana whenua, the first people here in Petone where I live, and that my name is Holly Walker. I work for Mahi Arongo, the Helen Clark Foundation, which is a public policy think tank based at Auckland University of Technology and founded on the values of our patron, the former New Zealand Prime Minister Helen Clark. And we're very fortunate at the Helen Clark Foundation to have a partnership with WSP, which supports a full-time staff member to research and write about some of the big public policy challenges facing Aotearoa and the world, with a particular emphasis on issues related to transport and urban form. Now, the current WSP fellow here at the foundation is Tom James, who you'll be hearing from soon. But before Tom, I was the WSP fellow until late last year, and it's my very great pleasure to host today's webinar. Before we start, I'd just like to cover off a few quick housekeeping matters. So this is a WSP webinar and it's open to the public and to WSP staff globally. So a big welcome to anyone who is joining us from either outside of Aotearoa New Zealand or outside of WSP. All of your microphones are muted automatically, so please don't worry if you're in a noisy environment. As long as you can hear us, then it's all good. I'd now like to introduce our panelists, and I'll ask them to turn on their cameras now while I tell you about them. So we're very fortunate to have an extremely experienced expert panel with us today. Tobias Thorsson is a senior transport and mobility advisor who joined WSP in 2005. Tobias is a civil engineer who has extensive experience in transport planning, travel demand forecasting, road use charging and cost benefit analysis, and also plentiful experience as a project manager, workshop leader and advisor in the area of transport and mobility. Dirk van Almesfort is Director of New Mobility at WSP in Sweden, and he has 20 years of experience as sustainable transportation planning. He's an internationally recognised expert in congestion pricing with pricing policy design and experience in various countries, and also holds a PhD in these matters. So a great deal of expertise with us with Dirk. And finally, Bjorn joined WSP in 2006, and he's currently Director of Transport Advisory at WSP Sweden. And he has a wealth of experience in transport planning and analysis as well, spanning more than 20 years, an expert in his field specialising in feasibility studies for both road and rail projects, and a good deal of project management experience, including integral roles in some of the largest strategic infrastructure projects in Sweden, and most notably for today's discussion as WSP's project director for the congestion charging design analysis team in Gothenburg between 2009 and 2013. And finally, Tom James, who I mentioned before, joined us here at Mahi Arongo, the Helen Clark Foundation, as the new WSP Fellow in February. Previously, he had worked as a press secretary and acting advisor to our Transport Minister, Michael Wood, and he's also worked in the private sector for insights consulting firms doing both qualitative and quantitative research. So thank you very much to our panel. I'll let them turn their cameras off again now, but they'll be back in 10 minutes or so. But first, I will very briefly present some key insights from a report about transport equity called Te Ara Matatika, or the Fair Path, that WSP and the Helen Clark Foundation co-published late last year. And I'll then invite Tom to introduce the topic of congestion charging equity that he's currently researching. After that, our panelists will rejoin us. Our experts from Sweden will actually present a few slides of their own about relevant to today's topic, and then we'll have a discussion for 20 minutes or so. And then we'll have about 10 minutes at the end for questions from you, the audience. So if you think of something that you'd like to ask, please put that into the questions box of your GoToWebinar control panel, and I'll be able to see these, and I'll make sure that we get to put them to the panel at the appropriate time. So we may finish slightly after the advertised 45-minute mark, just to make sure we can get through everything, perhaps around the 50 or 55-minute mark. So I hope you're able to stick with us until then. And we will share contact details at the end, so you can get in touch if you have any questions or would like to continue the conversation. So now I'd like to briefly introduce you to this report, Te Ara Matatika, or the FAIR Path. And really it starts with a vision, and that vision is that everybody in Aotearoa New Zealand, and indeed around the world, should be able to get where they need to go affordably, safely, and on time in ways that protect the planet. And it argues that in order to achieve this goal, and in fact to have any chance of meeting our emissions reduction targets, we will need to reprogram our transport system now around two key objectives. And those objectives are reducing our collective dependence on private cars as our main form of urban transport, and also making the transport system work better for those who are currently disadvantaged. If you'd like to read the full report, you can go to the handouts box of the GoToWebinar control panel. There you'll find a PDF that you can download, along with some other handouts of the slides from today's webinar. So by way of illustration of what we mean when we talk about transport equity, I just very quickly wanted to introduce Hannah. Hannah's a fictional character, but she illustrates many of the issues I think that are relevant to today's discussion. So Hannah is a 21-year-old student, and she also has a part-time job working late at night cleaning offices in the CBD. We're imagining that Hannah lives in Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland. Now, Hannah bought a car recently, thinking that it would be the most convenient option for her to get to university and also keep her safe getting home from work at night. But unfortunately, first of all, she had to take out a loan to buy that car from a high interest provider. And secondly, that car failed its warrant of fitness at its last test, meaning that Hannah is spending a very large percentage of her income paying back a loan on a car that she cannot drive at present because it's not legally allowed to be on the road. She's spending about 33% of her income on transport, mostly on, as I said, a car that she can't drive, which is making her very anxious and stressed, which is beginning to impact on her grades, and they're beginning to suffer. And really, transport is contributing to a constellation of issues that are impacting on Hannah and detracting from her quality of life. As I said, Hannah is a fictional character, but her predicament is very real, and there are thousands of people in situations just like hers in Aotearoa and indeed around the world.
Holly, sorry, Holly, just to jump in there, your slides aren't changing, so you might just need to...
okay, yeah. Thank you for letting me know. Apologies for that. How about, is that showing the Hannah on your screen now?
Not yet.
No, okay. Excuse me for a moment. I'll end the slideshow and begin it again, and let's see if that can help.
Brilliant, thanks, Holly.
All right. Are the slides now changing?
No, unfortunately not yet.
Oh my goodness, okay. Let's try this one more time. How about now?
Yes, they are. Thank you.
Great. My apologies for that. I'm sorry. You would have seen this lovely illustration of Hannah and each piece of information dropping down like this about her. But that's fine. Let's move on from this slide here, which is talking about the ways in which Hannah's story illustrates the issue of transport equity. So there's many ways that our current transport system is constraining some people's mobility. And creating barriers to equitable mobility. And those include cost, like the cost of car ownership and maintenance, the cost of parking fees and fines, or the opportunity costs of work foregone. They include accessibility barriers, like not being able to physically board buses and trains for reasons of health or disability. They include safety barriers, like the risk of being killed or injured on busy roads, but also other risks, like being harassed or assaulted on public transport, or not feeling safe to use active modes because of high traffic volumes. And simply practicality things, like not living near reliable public transport routes, or living near but having routes that don't service your destinations at the times that you need. Now, of course, all of us will experience some of these barriers from time to time, but the problem comes when the transport system consistently and regularly constrains mobility for some people. And unfortunately, that's much more likely to happen to some people than others. Here in New Zealand, those who are most likely to experience these forms of transport inequity include Māori, disabled people, people on very low incomes, women, members of the LGBTQI+ community, and members of minority ethnic groups. So of course, all of those groups have in common that they are all also more likely to experience other forms of disadvantage, and they're exacerbated by not being able to get around easily. So at the moment, our transport system is not only causing inequitable access to mobility, but actually entrenching and worsening wider systemic forms of economic and social inequity as well. Excuse me, looking over this side, it turns out that's what I need to do to get the slides to change. Fortunately, the problems of transport inequity and transport-related carbon emissions have a common solution, and that is reducing our dependence on cars as our main form of urban transport. It's not going to be possible to meet our emissions reduction targets without doing this. And it also won't be possible to have a more equitable transport system because simply replacing the petrol and diesel cars we're currently driving with electric ones still leaves in place many of the car dependency issues that someone like Hannah faces, and which she would still be scrambling to pay off high interest loans for a vehicle that she can't do without in the current transport system. So it's really important that we reduce our traffic volumes. That has the potential both to reduce our reliance on imported embedded carbon and to create major environmental, health, safety and equity benefits at home. And fortunately, it's increasingly seen as a key plank of effective climate change policy. And the New Zealand government has in fact proposed a target of reducing VKT from private vehicles. So VKT is vehicle kilometres travelled, for those who don't speak in this jargon, but has proposed in the emissions reduction plan a target of actually reducing the number of kilometres travelled in private vehicles by 20% by 2035. So that's a great development, but we'll need to think very carefully about how we go about doing that to make sure that equity considerations are front and centre of that conversation. Otherwise, there are risks that could undermine any emissions reduction benefits from the changes, and that's really where today's discussion of congestion pricing comes in. Very briefly, in our report, we conclude, In our report, we conclude with 5 recommendations for how we can address transport equity and emissions reduction currently. That's what we call the FAIR path. It leads away from congestion and hub and spoke CBD models to connected, localised urban communities where people can access most of their needs close to home and have ready access to public and active transport options when they need to go further. So arriving there means we need to reprogram our transport system now, and we make these 5 overarching recommendations for how to do that. As I said, reprogram the transport system, set vision, goals, strategic objectives, and the planning tools available to us to set out that this is where we need to go. Make sure that the transition is right and just. And tika means also supporting Māori communities to be part of this conversation. Reduce the overall need to travel, so prioritise urban design that shortens the distances between key destinations. Make sure the costs and benefits fall in the right place, and that's really where most of our discussion today, I think, is going to fall. It means things like making sure that any future congestion pricing schemes we introduce maximising equity. And finally, kickstart the transition with a bold intervention. So that might be, for example, and very topical right now, reducing the cost of public transport, making it free or very affordable to kickstart the mode shift that we want to see. So it's a very quick introduction to our report and its recommendations. My apologies for the issue with the slides at the beginning. But I would now like to hand over to my colleague, Tom, who will talk very briefly about his own research, which is going to zoom in and focus in more detail on this question of equitable congestion charging. Over to you, Tom.
Cool, thanks, Holly. Hope everyone can hear me. I'll just quickly run through what congestion charging is, just in case someone has joined this and isn't a transport nerd like myself, where Aotearoa New Zealand is at with the policy currently, and some initial thoughts on equity. So congestion charging is generally thought of as a geographically targeted fee for vehicles moving through an area. I mean, when you compare it to a toll road, which is just for that corridor, generally you'll have a cordon of tolls around an area, and this is to help reduce the number of vehicles moving through that area to improve traffic and reduce emissions. New Zealand doesn't have congestion charging or road pricing generally. The closest thing we have is our road user charges system, where non-petrol vehicles have to pay a distance-based charge so they contribute to our transport funding system. And the government, in partnership with Auckland Council, has been investigating what congestion charging will look like in Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, since I believe 2016 through the Congestion Question workstream. And I'd just like to acknowledge that the Transport Minister who kicked that off, Simon Bridges, has announced his retirement from politics this week. So just acknowledging him and his work to kick that off. The latest report released at the end of 2020 found that the potential benefits of implementing a scheme on the isthmus on Auckland Isthmus include improving the traffic so that it is the equivalent of the pre-COVID school holidays traffic all the time, which is an 8 to 12% efficiency gain, according to the numbers, and also helping to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The report recommended the next steps be public engagement to allow communities the opportunity to respond to the provisional scheme designs and potential benefits and costs. They also suggested any initial scheme could be timed to begin when the City Rail Link project opens, currently scheduled for late 2024, which is a rail project that helps double the number of people within a 30-minute public transport trip into the CBD. Since the release of the report, the Transport and Infrastructure Select Committee did an inquiry into it, and the government has consulted on whether to introduce it through their draft emissions reduction plan. Specifically, they consulted on whether to progress legislation to enable congestion pricing at urban centres, work with Auckland Council to implement the first phase of the Congestion Question report, as well as work with Wellington City Council and Wellington Regional Council in response to their requests for congestion pricing. We'll see the results of this consultation in May when the government releases its final emissions reduction plan and their decision on congestion charging. From my perspective, it currently seems inevitable they will go ahead with it. There's a broad consensus across stakeholders, as seen by the feedback to the Select Committee's inquiry, as well as across political parties, because that Select Committee report was unanimous. And recently, the Leader of the Opposition said it should replace the Auckland Regional Fuel Tax. However, there haven't been many specific policies laid out to ensure equity in the policy. I mean, there's a range of potential mitigations, which our colleagues from WSP Sweden will talk about shortly, I'm sure, from things like discounts and exemptions and rebates for different groups like residents and the disabled community, to things like implementing a charge only during peak times and investing revenue into public transport to improve alternatives to driving. The Congestion Question report proposed a daily price cap and a discount for financially vulnerable users, specifically looking at those with a community services card. But the question is, will this be sufficient from both an equity perspective? Will it actually mitigate the charge sufficiently for the least well-off? As well as from a political perspective, will it help get enough public buy-in so the decision makers don't back down if there's a backlash? So this is a very timely and important discussion to have to both raise awareness as well as to generate ideas to present the government with. I'm planning on doing further research into this area and producing a report, so I hope everyone will send me their thoughts after this discussion. And I'd like to end my quick intro by considering the counterfactual. What are the equity impacts if the government does not implement congestion charging? The evidence is quite clear that we won't achieve our emission reduction targets without some kind of pricing regime, as the vehicle kilometres travelled, and therefore emissions will continue to increase for the next couple of decades, as we haven't switched our fleet over to electric vehicles or zero emission cars yet. Also, programs like Let's Get Wellington Moving and the Auckland Transport Alignment Program won't achieve their congestion and reducing and emission reduction goals either without some form of congestion charge. But these emission savings will need to come from somewhere, and we'll have to rely on tools like the emissions trading scheme to disincentivize driving. A recent study said that relying on the ETS alone to drive electric vehicle uptake would mean a carbon price of approximately $575 per tonne, which would be around an extra $1.30 on already incredibly high petrol prices. And it would probably need to be much higher to actually get the same results as congestion charging would get, which, given that it would be a rise in petrol prices across the board, which would hit the least well off the hardest, given those on the lowest incomes, according to the latest data, spend about 28% of their income on transport, compared to only 8% for those on the highest incomes. So there's a cost of not doing it as well, which won't be geographically targeted, will potentially hit the least well off the hardest. And I think this point also applies to taking climate action in transport generally as well. As Holly talked about, doing nothing effectively locks in the causes of transport poverty and inequity into the future transport system. As well as the most disadvantaged are increasingly vulnerable to the risks of climate change. Congestion charging is one of the many tools we have to help change the system. It should be done, and done well, with equity at the forefront. So on that note, I'll now pass back over to Holly.
Thank you very much, Tom. Lots of really interesting and important issues raised there, which I'm really looking forward to getting into in the discussion. What I'd like to do now is invite our WSP Sweden colleagues to turn their cameras back on, and they have a short presentation, a few slides to lead us into our discussion, to talk about their own experiences of working on congestion charging schemes in different jurisdictions. So let's pull up their presentation now.
Thank you, Holly.
I'm going to hand over now to you, and just give me a signal when it's time to change the slide.
You can change the slide. So I'm going to talk briefly about the Vancouver mobility pricing project that we did. And it's a project that's been going on for about 2.5 years. Just as a teaser, so I cannot talk in 1 minute about 2 years of work, and we'll focus on the equity question. When we started out, we got 3 objectives: to reduce traffic congestion, to promote fairness, and support transportation investment, and to come up with a mobility pricing scheme that would help Vancouver with that. And I think the first hurdle that we faced is that fairness as an objective is not entirely workable, because fairness has some kind of moral righteousness in it that is very hard to debate and discuss and to make measurable. So pretty soon we ended up in developing tools and measures and metrics to talk more about equity from different kinds of perspectives. Both process equity, so not talking about people only, but talking with people and including them in the process and giving them a voice. And about outcome equity. So how do we design congestion pricing that it's equitable by design, which is pretty hard if you try to increase prices and reduce demand. How does that not be regressive or end up with the most vulnerable groups having being hit hardest? But also by compensation. So by thinking about how do we have rebates or discounts or other tax reform so that we can compensate for the extra costs that we are imposing, and also by using revenues for more systemic changes that the inequities actually don't occur as much anymore. So it's changing the urban form, investing in public transportation, lowering income taxes, increasing minimum wages, all those kinds of measures. From that whole analysis on equity and how can we make that measurable, we ended up with affordability as well. And in that whole affordability discussion, it's pretty hard in Vancouver not to talk about housing, because the increase in housing prices and the cost of housing are pushing more vulnerable groups away from the city center where all the jobs are, making travel distances longer, making them more dependable on car use. And that's where we are now in Vancouver, where you see on the right side a little bit of an excerpt from the regional plan, where they actually develop objectives to define affordability as a combination of housing and transportation costs, and not only one of those two. And I'll hand over to, I think, Tobias, right?
Yeah, I'll have to unmute as well. Thank you. So I will speak briefly about the congestion charging in Stockholm. I think we can take next slide. Also here, it's many years of work and investigation studies, and I will just try to summarize in a few minutes what the system looked like and the history behind it. So this is what the system looked like today. You see the city of Stockholm, and all the red dots are where people with cars have to pay. And the fee is between 15 to 45 Swedish krona, depending on when during the day you travel. So during peak hour, it's the highest fee, 45 Swedish krona, which is about €4.5. And there is also a maximum fee during the day, so it's 13.5 euro between March and November, and a little bit lower in the winter time. It's about 10 euros a day. And the system is on from 6 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. during Monday to Friday. And during summer holiday, there is 3 weeks in July where there is no charge. And you can see the green line to the left. There is a motorway passing through Stockholm from south to north. So from the beginning, that was free of charge if you just were traveling through. But since 2016, you also have to pay if you just drive on the motorway through Stockholm. You can take the next slide. So shortly about the history. So this system was designed to ease congestion in car traffic in Stockholm. So the first thing was a trial period of a half year in 2006. And before the trial, the public in Stockholm was against the system. They didn't want to pay congestion charging. But during this half year, people in Stockholm could experience the benefits of the system. So people that still took the car, of course, they had to pay the congestion charging, but they could also see that the travel times decreased, because around roughly 10 to 20% of the traffic volume decreased. So travel time improved, queues was decreasing, so they experienced benefits. And people already in the public transport system also could see the benefits, because the buses are also in the queues. But also when they started this trial period, they did large improvements in public transport, so more buses. So people in the public transport system also experienced improvements. So after this trial period, there was a referendum in the autumn of 2006. So from the beginning, people in Stockholm was against the system. But when the question came in the referendum, do you want to see a permanent system in Stockholm? The yes side won there. So since then, for 15 years, we have had congestion charging in Stockholm. There have been some changes through the years. There was in the beginning an exception for low emission vehicles, but that was abolished in 2012. In 2016, the system was extended. For example, the motorway got a congestion charge. They increased the charges, and also in 2020, the charges was increased again. And the focus has slightly changed because in the beginning it was the system and the fees were set to ease congestion, but now it's more focused on to fund new infrastructure to extension of the tube system in Stockholm.
Yes, and moving on to Gothenburg, the second city in Sweden that got a congestion charging system. And you can change to the next slide, I think. The congestion charging in Gothenburg, when we started designing it, we had quite a lot of help from Stockholm. All the legislation was in place, so we could start just focusing on designing a system, which is not very easy in Gothenburg. There are no natural barriers like in Stockholm with all the water, which meant that it was quite difficult to find a working system. But we managed, and the system that you see on the screen is more or less the same system that started in 2013. The charge is quite low, a little bit lower than Stockholm, ranging from 150 to 350 New Zealand dollars per passage, with a maximum of 10 New Zealand dollars per day. And due to the geographical difficulties we also had to start with something we call a multi-passage exemption, meaning that you can pass as many stations you want within 1 hour. And this was the only way to get a system that was working well. Other details in Gothenburg are quite similar to Stockholm, Monday through Friday. There are different charges during the day and no charge in July. So in many aspects, quite similar to Stockholm, actually. And we can change to the next slide. There we have it. Gothenburg is also quite smaller than Stockholm, a population of around 500,000, but congestion charging still works well to ease congestion. The objectives we had in Gothenburg were to reduce congestion, improve air quality, and also provide 14 billion Swedish kronor to infrastructure investments. And one lesson to be learned is that you should not have a high focus on revenue when talking about congestion charging. This meant that we had to design a system that was not optimal for reducing congestion and improving air quality, but instead the charges are a little bit too high to give maximum effect on that. Equity was a concern in Gothenburg, but due to political reasons, it wasn't really raised. Instead, the discussion was on secondary equity, that the revenue was meant to go to infrastructure investments, primarily in public transport, mostly a rail tunnel under the city of Gothenburg. So the discussion was that this is good for public transport users, and that way it is equitable. There was also a referendum in Gothenburg in 2014, 1 year after the start of the system, and the referendum would clearly said no to continue to congestion charging. But the referendums in Sweden are not binding, so the politicians decided not to follow their referendum. And the system is still working today, and I would say it is accepted by most users in the Gothenburg region. They see it as more or less something natural, like a parking fee or similar. So that was some very short intros on what has happened in Vancouver and Sweden so far, and I think Holly will come back with her camera now.
Yes, I am back. Thank you so much. It's a very interesting and instructive set of examples for us to be thinking about here in New Zealand. And it leads us very nicely into our discussion now. So let's put our lovely faces on the screen so that everybody can remember who is speaking. And let me just pull up my correct slide here. Okay, so we've had these 3 case studies. You know, Stockholm in many ways a similar size and a good comparison perhaps for Auckland. Here in New Zealand, Gothenburg, similar size in some ways, perhaps some comparable features with Wellington. And then that non-Scandinavian example from Dirk in Vancouver, where the very important issue of housing price was a significant factor. I suppose I'd like to ask each of you, thinking about those examples and other experiences that you've had, having worked on these schemes, what do you think are the principles or the guiding factors that should be included in the legislation that enables these schemes in order to maximise equity and effectiveness of both the emissions reduction intention of the schemes, but also making sure that equitable outcomes are embedded in them from the very beginning?
Perhaps I can start by saying something from Gothenburg, where the legislation was already in place from Stockholm. And that would be to make sure that there is flexibility in the legislation. We had quite a lot of ideas on how to make a better system to differentiate charges, etc. But the legislation didn't allow us to do that. So flexible legislation allowing the experts to really design a system without too much constraint.
That's interesting. So perhaps ensuring that equity is a central factor, but not dictating how that should be determined and leaving it to each city to design a scheme that works for their particular population.
Yeah, I would say that. And we also see that in Sweden, even though we think Stockholm and Gothenburg are similar, when we started studying in Gothenburg, we saw that the differences are larger than you think.
Perhaps that leads me into another question to add on. So please feel free, Dirk and Bjorn, to add on to what Tobias has just said. But examples, I suppose, of what works in different cities. So how can things like the geographic typology of the city, that whether it's a compact or a sprawling city, the size of the city, be factored in successfully into congestion charging schemes?
Yeah, so it's not always captured in legislation, like in your last question, right? So I think what is in common in all these places is that we used some kind of starting out with the policy objectives, getting that straight, translating that into indicators, and then finding out alternatives that actually perform well on those indicators. And then you see differences between Stockholm, which has a lot of water, and you cover the bridges and you're basically done. That's oversimplifying it. But in Gothenburg, the road network is pretty dense, and Vancouver is, for example, a polycentric city with different centers, and has a lot more urban sprawl and car dependency than what we see in Sweden. The how you think about it is the same, but the policy that you end up with is different. So in Vancouver, it made a lot more sense to look at distance-based charging and in a differentiated way, so that you can travel between communities without large boundary effects, but still have a pricing effect included. Well, in Stockholm, that was not necessary at all. So it's having a good process that starts with good objectives. I think that leads to success.
My apologies, I mixed your names up before, Bjorn and Tobias. I'm so sorry about it. Tobias, is there anything you'd like to add to what's just been said?
No, it's, I mean, from the Gothenburg example, it's you can also say that it's good to be able to be flexible, because as we talked about the barriers, we could see that we didn't see from the beginning, but we saw that so that we need to do some changes in the system. And I think you can't make a perfect system from the beginning. And if you want to make changes, it's good that could be easy to do changes in a system, to be flexible. And so that's one thing to think about.
Yes,
I think
really. Sorry, Dirk, you go ahead.
Yeah, I was also thinking about the equity question, because that is relatively new, even for us. When we started doing it in Sweden, there isn't that much of an equity problem as there isn't compared to North America, for example, or Vancouver. And it needs new solutions too, right? So if you want to have a really equitable charging system, then by design, lower income people or vulnerable groups need to pay less. And that's a technical issue, how to actually do that, how you identify those people and make them pay less and not reimburse them in the end, because then they still had to have the money to begin with. So that has created some new lessons on how to include equity actually by design and not by reimbursement.
Because I'm very interested in exactly that thing, I suppose. You know, what are the ways that those potential equity impacts can be mitigated? And in terms of what you've just said, the sort of the process of learning on the go while implementing these kinds of schemes, do you think there's a sort of a best practice example, or what's currently considered an effective way to do that, to ensure that the scheme is not disproportionately hitting people on very low incomes?
Yeah. So what we're discussing in Vancouver is things like giving people mobility credits, so that they, or having free rides, a number of free rides, or because it's hard in legislation to identify people by income and adapting the charge level to that. So it depends also on your legislative system what you're allowed to do or not. But those are ways that you can work on it. Reducing income tax or tax levels in income tax and property tax is also something that was talked about. So that yes, they still pay, but they have how do you call it, a discount somewhere else to start with, and they can feel themselves how they want to spend that money. Is it on using transit, or do they want to use the car? So it's a process that depends on the local legislation and what room you have to maneuver with other taxes or other kinds of pricing instruments.
I'd like to bring in some questions from our audience as well at this point, to make sure we get to ask some of those. And related to that matter we've just been talking about, Darren asks, don't rebates encourage those they're given to still choose private vehicles? Would a more general payment enable people to use this for alternative modes, if it makes sense to them? So I suppose, yeah, there's a lot of very complicated factors we're trying to consider here, making the scheme not disproportionately negatively impact the equity, but at the same time encourage people across all socioeconomic and income levels to take alternative modes as these become available. So any reflections on, I suppose, that issue of how to get that balance right in a scheme from any of you?
Yeah. I think that it's, of course, you want people to use other modes than the car. And if you can do that with some kind of mobility card or other measures, then that's great. But I think we also have to recognize, at least in the cities that I've worked with, that people that are more vulnerable are also more likely to have jobs that are not well connected to transit. It can be in production or factories that are not in the CBD. And they are, in that situation, they are more dependent on the car. So if you can solve that by giving them better transit, but maybe it's societally easier to give them cheaper access to a car so they actually can get to work.
So I suppose this relates to also what needs to go hand in hand with these schemes, because it's all very well to introduce an additional cost to driving into the city, but if that is not accompanied by investment in public transport that provides realistic alternatives for people, then it's just adding a cost with potential equity implications. So a question here from Barry, it relates to this, is about the London congestion charge legislation. I'm not sure how familiar you are with that example, but he says, I understand that for the London congestion charge legislation, it required a percentage of the revenue raised to be invested in public transport. Has this been legislated anywhere else, or perhaps have you worked on examples where this has been a factor? How does that work in practice? And is that a good, we had a warning before about not hanging too much on new infrastructure from the revenue from these schemes, but if it is reinvested in public transport, can that be part of progressing both the alternatives and the disincentives to driving at the same time?
Yeah, I think we have the answer. I was just hoping that Bjorn or Tobias would speak to it, because I think Sweden has exactly done this, like London. So.
So now it's both in Stockholm, the revenue goes to the tube extension, and in Gothenburg we, as Bjorn told before, a lot of funding comes from the congestion charging to investments, and that was the problem in the design that we that was an important measure.
I think it's interesting to add that in those investments in the metro line extensions, it's actually coupled to housing investments as well around these stations. So it's actually not just infrastructure, but it's how does the city grow kind of policy.
Yes, I was just going to say, I think particularly in our context here in Aotearoa at the moment, with a very highly rampant housing market and a big shortage of affordable housing, land use planning and urban development prioritizing more housing around transport hubs is going to be a really important part of this picture as well. And so it's interesting to hear that those have been specifically linked from a policy perspective in some of these other jurisdictions. Please go ahead while I look at these questions.
Okay, I think we can also add that in all the cities that implemented this, so even London or Milan, or in there are cases, they also made investments in public transportation before actually introducing it as part of the plan. So it's not just congestion charging that you introduce, but it's part of something that is bigger.
I think that was and that was a way of get the public acceptance in Stockholm. I think that they made improvements in the public transport at the same time the system was implemented.
Yes, I'm really interested in this example, I guess, from Stockholm in the initial public opposition that turned into support for the scheme at the referendum. What were the factors that were, do you think, influential on that change of opinion? Is it just about having the lived experience of having the scheme in place and feeling what it's like to live with less congestion that turns people's views around on this?
I think
we've researched this for many years, so we're all pretty much on top of this issue. And it's not just Stockholm or Gothenburg where we see this happening. It's also from London or Bergen or other cities. There's always this, when you start talking about pricing, people have a general idea of what it could be and how it could be beneficial, and about 30% thinks, okay, this could be a good idea. And then you start saying, well, this is how much we will charge and where, and then people say, oh, this is going to cost me money. And the newspapers will write mainly about how much money it will cost and not about the benefits it will give. So then just before introduction, you're about 15% of the people accepting it. And that's where most systems fail, because then you need a lot of political courage. But once you open and you actually deliver on the things that you promise to do, and transparent with where the revenues are going and what effects it actually achieves, then people get over their status quo bias, their overestimation of cost, their underestimation of benefits, and then very quickly the public opinion changes. And it's consistent for all the cases that we see. It's kind of it's not a law of public acceptance, but it's pretty strong empirical evidence on it.
Just requires that initial political courage, doesn't it, to make the change in this place. Here's an interesting question, because I think all of these schemes we're talking about are based on a model of, commuting into the CBD and back out again. And that has traditionally been the model, but, COVID-19 has given us a taste of what it's like to do a lot more of our work from home for those of us who work in jobs that can be done from home. And also, we understand that the sort of equitable urban design and transport futures that we need in our cities are much more localized urban communities, less about the CBD. So there's an interesting question here. Are there examples of incentives for businesses to relocate away from city centres to help to decentralise those transport needs and maybe reduce the journey times and reduce the number of people who are travelling long distances each day. Has that been a feature of any of the schemes you've worked on, or have you seen that occur in these locations over time?
The only thing I can think of is that when we see general tax benefits, for example, home equipment for internet connections, or that they are now tax deductible, and so as an employer you can help your employees more to work from home, and the changes. So we have travel cost expenses that you can get reimbursed, and those are moving away a little bit from giving those reimbursements for car use and getting tax-free bicycles, or getting so there's those kinds of trends, but I haven't seen big policies yet that focus on this.
Now, look, there's so many more interesting questions here from our audience, and my apologies to those who we haven't had time to get to. It's clear there's a lot more that we could be talking about here and a lot for us to learn. Maybe though I'd like to finish, where we started. Tom set out where we're at in the conversation about congestion charging in New Zealand right now, which is essentially we're just starting out. Now you, our expert panel, have worked on these issues for many years now. What do you think from each of you are the most important lessons you've learned that you would want to sort of impart to a country that's getting ready to introduce congestion pricing for the first time, and particularly with equity in mind?
I think one lesson learned, and if you compare, I've been involved both in Stockholm and Gothenburg, and in Stockholm it was much more information to the public before the system was in place, whereas in Gothenburg it was a political decision, and all of a sudden they implemented the system with not so much information to the public, and I think that's why you had it was so much harder with the public opinion in Gothenburg compared to Stockholm. So information is very important.
Bringing people with us, yes. Other reflections on the lessons learned?
Yeah, I think that political courage part, I think we have to hammer on it. So the information is important, but I don't see a way forward where you can, with communication, get public acceptance before you do it. There's going to be opposition, how well you inform them, but it's very important that you inform them. And the other way is to really do your homework and look at the scenarios and different alternatives and get the metrics right, so that you actually can deliver on the things that you promise, so that the reality turns out as you thought it did. And the third one is be open about how revenues are going to be spent, so that people know it's not wasted money that they're spending, but there's actually good being done with it.
Any further reflections? Tom, any reflections from you having listened to the discussion?
Just fascinating to hear about the different ways that it happened, and certainly agree with that point about political courage. It is, even though like stakeholders and political parties seem to be pretty on board, I think actually the general public doesn't have much of an idea of what this is, and probably isn't that keen on it. I mean, you look at the submissions to the Select Committee inquiry, I think it was something like the majority of submissions from stakeholders and from groups was positive, but then the majority of submissions from individuals was negative. So I agree there's a big public engagement piece to do here. Definitely, I think that's a great lesson to take away from other jurisdictions.
Well, look, thank you. Unfortunately, that is all that we have time for, and it's a shame because I know there's a lot more to discuss, but I think you've given us some really important things to think about as we are beginning this process here in New Zealand. So I'd like to thank our panelists very, very much for a really stimulating discussion, and especially because you've joined us at a very inhospitable hour from Sweden. So thank you for that, and thank you very much to all of our audience for your interest and attendance. I hope it's been interesting, and I hope it's been thought-provoking, and we would love to hear your thoughts about this topic. So Tom's email address is on the screen and in the handouts, and the addresses. Our panelists have also very generously agreed to be contacted if people are working on these issues here in New Zealand and have specific questions. So please do take down these email addresses on the screen if you would like to get in touch. And as Tom mentioned, he will be doing more work on this topic, and we expect it to be the topic of his first report in his new role as WSP Fellow here at the Foundation. So thank you very, very much to all of you once again for your participation and attendance today and for sharing those insights. Let's end as we started, and this is a karakia that acknowledges that our working conversation is finished for now, and I wish you all the very best for the rest of your day if you're here in Aotearoa, and for a restful evening for those who are joining from the Northern Hemisphere. Ka whakairea te tapu kia wātia ai te ara, kia tūriki whakataha ai, kia tūriki whakataha ai, hui e tai ki e. Kia ora everybody, and thank you so much.